Alright, so by now you should already have your models.py file filled out for the groups application. And we're going to open up views.py under groups and start filling out some very basic views for our actual groups application. And what we're going to do is a couple of things. First, a couple of imports. I will say from Django.contrib.auth for authorization, mixins, and then I'm going to import, and I will import two mixins here. The login required mixin, and then the permission required mixin. And if you want, you can put these on multiple lines just by having parentheses. So something that's common to see is if you have really long import lines, you can just use multi-lines with a parentheses there. And then what we're also going to do is a bunch of other imports. We will say from Django.core.url resolvers import reverse. And then I will also say from Django.views import, and then I'm going to import those generic views. And that's just the class-based views that we've worked with before. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to say class, and I will have a create group view. So if someone is logged into the site and they want to create their own group, kind of like creating your own subreddit, this will be the view for that. And it's going to take in the login required mixin, and it will also take in the create view. And then here, I just need to specify the fields I want them to be able to create. So we say fields is equal to, and I want them to be able to edit the name of the field, or the name of the group, I should say, and then the description. And those are just directly linked to the models.py. So the name and the description. I don't want them to be able to edit things like slug or members because that really wouldn't make sense. So when they create a group, it takes a generic create view. And then finally, I just need to connect it to the actual model. So if I'm going to connect it to the group model, that means I need to import it. So we'll say from groups.models, and you can also say from .models. I will import group and then group member. That way I can call them throughout these class-based views. So right now we have our very basic create view. So to actually connect this to a template, we're going to need to later on edit our template underneath groups as well as our urls.py file. But let's continue. I'm going to create a detail view and a list view, and then we'll actually mess around with those template files. So I will say class, and let's just say single group. And this is just going to be a generic detail view. So it's just the details of that specific group. Things like the posts inside that group, etc. And that's just going to be connected to a model called group. So pretty simple. And then we'll have a list groups. So when someone goes to like the list groups page, they'll just see a list of all the available groups. Kind of like selecting a list all subreddits or something like that. And then we'll say generic, and that will be a list view. And you can see already that class-based views making our lives a lot simpler. And then we'll say model is equal to group. So now I'm going to save that. Looks like we have three main class-based views. Now let's head over to the templates and actually create those template files that connect them. We already have group base, group detail, group form, and group list, so we should be pretty good to go. Let's start off by saying group base, and in the group base.html, I'm going to say extends from base.html, and then I'm going to call block content. So that's going to extend from the actual base.html file that I've already created underneath the project templates. And then I have my content here, and I'm going to create a div container class, and then I will say div class row in case I need that for bootstrap purposes. And then I'm going to make three blocks here. I'll have a pre-group block, a group content block, and then a post-group block that we'll see how we can use later on. So this block I will say is pre-group. We can actually just put it like this so it's a little more readable. Then I'm going to copy and paste this, and then we will have a block that is the group content, so group underscore content, and then the post group. So we won't use all of these blocks in every template, but in case we ever want to have something that goes before the group content, we have pre-group. During the group content, we have group content, and then after the group content, we have post group. Okay, so that's all we need, so I will save that. And then we're going to continue on with the other templates. So let's start off with the group detail page. So we'll come over to group detail, that very next template, and I will say extends from groups / group underscore base.html, that HTML file we were just working with, and then let's put everything we want to occur before the group name. So I will call block, and this will be my pre-group block. And then as a heading 1, I'm going to have the group name, and I can call that using template syntax by saying group.name. So remember, with those class-based views, there's actually a context dictionary that gets passed that holds everything that the model has. So since groups have names, I can just call group.name. And this word group is the lowercase singular version of the actual model. So if you come to models.py, this is the lowercase model, G-R-O-U-P, which is where that actual context dictionary comes from. And that just, as we've told you before, comes from class-based views. Then heading 2, I'm going to say member count, and here I'm going to input another basically call to the context dictionary, and I'm going to call group members. So again, come back to the model. Remember, we have members here, and off of that, I'm actually going to call a method, and I can call the count method or attribute off of that. And if you want a list of these, you can check out the documentation for various things you can call off of model objects. All right, now the next step for this actual group detail page is on that group detail page where it's actually listing the posts. If you're a member and you're logged in, I want you to have a leave or join button there. So let's try to add that in. Inside this same pre-group block, I'm going to create a div, and I will call this content in case I ever want to edit this with CSS. And inside of this, I'm going to say if, and I will say if user in group.members.all. So that means if this user happens to be inside this essentially an array or list of all the members inside that actual group model, then I'm going to do the following. I'll have an anchor tag that has an href to URL and then groups leave. So we haven't actually created this view or URLs yet, but later on in our URLs file for the actual groups, what we're going to be able to have is the option to leave the group. So we only want that if the user's already in the group. So we'll say, okay, if the user's already in the group and they're visiting this page, they have the option to leave, and they're going to be able to leave, but we also have to define what slug, and that's just going to be equal to group.slug. And we'll kind of edit this later on, but let's actually make sure this is a URL template with those percent signs. And then inside of this, we're going to go ahead and give this a class. So we'll say class, and let me collapse this so we get a little more room here. Class is equal to, we'll just have this be a normal button. Let's say btn. Actually, let's make it a really large button so it's kind of obvious. I can start this on a new line. So we'll say class button, let's say button -lg for a large button. I'm going to fill out this button, and then let's make it a warning button so it's like really obvious to the user that if they click that button, they're going to leave. Okay, and then what we're also going to do is add in a span. So we're going to use glyphy icons or glyph icons, and this will allow me to actually have an icon there instead of just like a word that says leave group. So it's going to look like an exit sign or something. So we'll have it be a remove circle, and that'll be right next to the word leave. So we do this by creating a span, and then inside that span, we create a class, and that class is going to be a glyph icon, and then it's glyph icon dash remove dash circle. And you can technically not really have the span. That's just kind of an icon I want to put in there. And you can check out the Bootstrap documentation for all these codes and all the different icons they have available. And then I'm going to say leave. Okay, so we have this button that shows up if a member is already in that group, and then they can click on that button and they'll leave the group. So that's if that user is already in the group. Else, we should probably give them the option to join the group. So we'll say else, and it's going to be a really similar thing. We'll have h, and then let's actually just copy this because it's so similar. So I'm going to copy this entire anchor tag and then post it here. And then inside this anchor tag, let's change what we want. So else, if they're not going to leave it, then we know they're going to join it. So we'll make another view later on for URL groups join. Same thing is going to be the slug, and we can have the same thing as a button warning. You can change if you want button warning or button default, etc. for coloring. We will have, instead of a remove circle, I'm going to say OK circle, and then we will say instead of leave, join. All right, again, basic idea. We check if that user who's currently visiting this page is in group.members.all, and then whether or not they're going to leave or join. All right, now we're actually almost done with group detail.html. I'm going to scroll down past this block, and then I will start a new block, and this is just going to be my group content here. And then what we will do is, I don't want the group content, that is the list of actual posts, to take up the entire page. I kind of want them lined up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is say div class, and I will give this a class of call medium-8. Those are those bootstrap formations. And then we'll say if, and I'm going to say if group.post.count is equal to 0. And that basically means if the group doesn't actually have any posts in it yet, what I will say is, instead of listing something, I'm just going to have a header 2 that says no posts in this group yet. Whoops, let's make sure we spell that right. So no posts in this group yet. And then if we don't have else, actually let's say else. Else, what else are we going to do? We're going to say for post in group.post.all, and then I'm going to just cycle through this. But what I'm going to do is say include, and then we'll say posts /_ post.html. And let me kind of describe, since we haven't really seen include yet, what's going on there. And other than that, we're actually done with this page. So let's take a little bit of time to kind of do a little description of line 31. So all I'm doing here is I'm saying if the group currently has no posts, just have a heading 2 that says no posts in this group yet. But in the more likely situation where we actually already have posts in that groups, what I want to do is say for posts in groups.post.all, and then I'm going to include. Now include is kind of a way of saying extends, except you're going to essentially insert it right in the middle of an HTML file. So instead of actually extending and using blocks, what you can do is use this include statement to inject an HTML file. Since there's going to be so much stuff going on with the posts themselves, a lot of HTML calls, a lot of template calls, a lot of template tags, I don't want to include all of that in this group detail.html. Instead, what I will do is have that all taken care of in this posts.html file. And since this is going to be injected, to kind of signify that as a developer, I have this underscore there. Now, I technically don't need that underscore there. It's really more for me to understand that this particular piece of HTML file is designed to be injected into other HTML files using include. So that's the kind of syntax that I'm going to be using to actually understand that. So that's it for the group detail page. And what we're going to do is finish off those other class-based views that we just created. So we'll come back up here. The next one we're going to do is the group list page. So that should be pretty straightforward. So let's go to group list. Click on that, and then this is going to extend from groups/group_base.html. Let's collapse that directory tree again. And then I'm going to call a block for my pre-content or pre-group content. Then here, what I will say is give this a class of call medium for, and a lot of these class calls, you can adjust them yourself. This is more for styling. And then we will say content. And now what I want to do is check if a user's logged in and they're authenticated, I want something to say a welcome back username. And if not, it's going to just say, hey, welcome to the groups page, select the group. So let's try that out. We'll say if the user is _authenticated. And I can use all these user template calls because of the Django.authorization package. It basically takes care of all the heavy lifting to connect this on the back end. So you can just say user.isAuthenticated. And what I will do is if they're authenticated, I'll have a heading 2 on this web page that says welcome back. And inside of this heading 2, I'm also going to have an anchor tag, and it's going to link to their actual profile. So we'll say a URL, then posts _user, so that it actually links to their profile where it has a list of all their posts in case they ever want to see that. And then I also need to provide their username. So we'll say username is equal to user.username. And then inside of here, in the actual anchor tag, what I'm going to do is say @ and with template tags, oops, I need to inject this with double. We'll say @ user.username. username. So that basically has that kind of Twitter quality, or basically any social network quality, where if this user is authenticated, it'll say welcome back. There'll be a link here that says @user.username, and if you click on that link, it will take you to a list of all your posts. Now we're going to take care of that view later on when we're dealing with posts. Now we'll end the if. So for everyone though, it will show the following. It'll say groups heading 2, and then we'll just have a paragraph here that says welcome to the groups page, exclamation point. Save that. And then the other thing I want to do is check that if the user is authenticated, I should be able to kind of have a button there that says create new group. So we'll do that as well. We'll say if outside of this first div tag, if the user is underscore authenticated, I will have an anchor tag here where again the anchor tag is linked to URL groups underscore create. And there's a couple ways you could have done this. You don't have to do it exactly the same way I'm doing it, but I'm just going to do it with a simple button call. btn, btn-md, btn-fill, btn-warning. Now remember from the navigation bar, technically the user can already create a group from any page. There's a little link in the navigation, but since you're on the groups page, it might be nice to actually have it as a separate button as well on the actual group page, so that's why I'm adding this in. And then we will go ahead and add a span and use those glyph icons. So in the span, I will give it the class glyph, whoops, let me make sure I spell that right, glyph icon, whoops, having trouble with this, glyph icon, dash plus dash sign. So it looks like a little plus sign. And we'll just have the text right next to it be create new group. And then we need to end that if. All right, so that's it for that at the very top of the page. And so that will end the pre-group block. So it just checks welcome back and then says welcome to groups page, has a little button there if you're authenticated to create a new group. Next what we're going to do is the actual group or content. So we'll say have a new block of group content. And then let's go ahead and give this one more division. We'll say this should be call dash median dash 8, so it doesn't take up everything. And then we'll say div class, I'll say list group in case we ever want to edit this with CSS. And now I'm going to have a for loop. So I'm going to say for group in object underscore list, and we'll talk about this object underscore list later on. So our for group in object list, I'm going to have an anchor tag, and we'll give this a URL call. We'll say URL groups single, where the slug is equal to the group dot slug itself. And I'm going to have this actually have a class. We'll say this class will be list group item in case I ever want to edit or call it. And then let's kind of start this rest of this anchor tag on a new line. And that is going to have, let's say inside this anchor tag, we'll have a heading 3 with a class of its own. And this class will say title, list, group, item, heading. So in case you ever want to edit that, that's where you can do it in the CSS. And then I will say the group actual name. Okay, so that's the heading 3. And what is actually going on here? Let's kind of briefly describe it. So far I have for every group in my object list, which is essentially going to be a list of the actual groups. Remember, this is the group list HTML. I'm going to have an anchor tag that so far has a link to the group name. So if you click on that group name, it'll take you to that group's single page through this slug connection. But there's still more I want to add here. I'm going to, inside of the same anchor tag, create a div class, and we'll say list group item. I'm going to call it text, and then say container dash fluid. So that's a bootstrap a container call. And then here is where I'm finally going to use that description. So we'll say description underscore HTML, and then pipe operator, I'll say safe. So that allows me, if you remember from the previous clone project, that allows me to actually use HTML code in a safe way so that if something is bold, you actually see bold text instead of seeing bold template tags or bold HTML tags. Now what we want to do is right after this, we're going to call another div, and this is just going to be a row. And I know there's a lot to type here, so if you want, just copy and paste this from the actual solution so you don't make any typos anywhere. It's really easy to make a typo here, and I'm sure I'm making one right now, which we're going to fix later. And we'll create one more that says call medium 4, and we'll create a span, and we will say this is a class, and we'll give this a badge class. And then what we're going to do here is inside the span, I'll have group members count, and then inside of that, I'm going to say member, and I will say group.members.count pluralize. And later on, we'll actually see what this does. So pluralize. Make sure I don't accidentally spell that wrong. Okay, so that's the end of this particular div. And then we're going to start one more inside of this row object. So this will be div, and this is also going to be called md4. And here again, we'll basically have the same thing, span with the class is equal to badge. And then we'll call group.post.count. And then outside of this, we will have post with template tagging. I'm going to inject group post count, and then we will call pluralize on that as well. Okay, so a ton of div tags here, and I promise we'll go over all of this at the very end. But now what we're going to do is basically scroll down and end this, make sure everything's lined up, and we should have 2 div tags after the end4, and then an anchor and 3 more div tags before that, and everything else should be lining up. So if you don't have that, you probably made a typo somewhere, so just a copy and paste from the solutions. That's a lot easier than typing along with me. But let's actually go through this group list page since there's a lot going on here. First off, in pre-group, what we're doing is just checking if the user is authenticated. If they are, we have a little thing that says welcome back at whoever the user is, and it links to that user's post. So you log in, you go to the groups page, it says welcome back Jose, you click on that, then it takes a list of all Jose's posts. Then it says end div. Now for everybody, we say welcome to the groups page. Then we check, okay, if the user is authenticated, let's add a little button there so they can create a new group. There's also one on the navigation bar, but we should have one here as well. That's the end of the pre-group block. Now it's the much more complicated group content block, but it's actually not so bad. Basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, for every group in this object list, which is going to be a list of all the group objects, we're going to have, and essentially you can kind of ignore these class calls since they're just CSS and focus on what's really going on here. So here we're going to say group name, and you can click on that group name and it will take you to the single group page, so that group detail page that we just created earlier. And then the actual description we call with description underscore HTML, and we call it with safe. That way, in case there's any bold tags or italics tags, whatever, they happen to be displayed correctly. And then we have these group members count and group post count. So on the actual page where it details the groups that are available, it will say how many posts that group has and how many members that group has as well. And that's basically all that's going on here. It's just the large amount of div class calls that kind of make it hard to read. But essentially, it's just a pretty simple for loop that's displaying the group name, the number of members in that group, and the number of posts in that group. Then once you click the group name, it will take you to that actual group detail page. And that's all that's going on in groups list. Now finally, what I want to fill out is, let's say someone does click on create a new group. They're going to go to groups create, and that's going to be created by that create view. So let's come over here and set that up with group underscore form. So in this page, I'm going to say extends groups slash group underscore base.html. And then I'm also going to, remember this is a form, so I will load up Bootstrap 3 to make the form look nice. Then we'll have block, and then it will say group underscore content. And here, doesn't really matter what heading size you use. I'm just going to say create a new group, and then we'll create a form here. We'll say form, whoops, not for, form. And this form, it won't have a class, but it will have an action. And the action will link back to URL groups underscore create. So this is basically linking to our create view. And then we'll give this post method, and we'll actually also give it an ID in case we ever want to edit it with CSS. And we'll say group form. Let's make it group form with camel casing, just so I know. And inside of here, since it's a form, we always need our CSRF token. And then below that, we're going to have the form call. So with template tagging, we'll call bootstrap form, as we saw before, bootstrap underscore form, and then pass in the form. So this makes it look a lot nicer using bootstrap 3, which again, you had a pip install. Finally, we'll have an input block, and that will just be type submit, and we'll say value says create. So it says create, and then let's give this a class. We don't need to give it a name. It'll be btn, btn primary, and then btn large. Okay, so definitely did a lot of stuff here, so let's quickly review. We finished off all the templates for groups as well as most of the views. So let's quickly review. So what we did in this lecture was we came over to views.py in the groups application, and we created 3 main views: for creating a new group, for looking at a single group, and then the list groups. And then we actually went to the templates and filled that out ourselves. So the base template just has these 3 blocks: what goes before the group, what the actual group content is, and then the post group. That way we can easily separate them. Then we actually have the detail page of a group, which just shows the group name, the number of members in that group, and then it actually says if the user is in that group, there's a leave button. If the user is not in that group, there's a join button. That way we can connect users to groups themselves. And here we just say, okay, if there's no posts in the group, just say no posts. If there are posts though, we're just going to kind of inject this underscore post.html content that we'll work with later on in the future lecture. Then we actually went to the group list page, which was a little complicated, but essentially just shows welcome back to the user, says welcome to the groups page. If the user is authenticated, we have a little new button that says you can create a new group. And then here we just actually list out every group with the link to the group, and then the number of members and the number of posts in that group. Finally, for that create view, we have group underscore form, where it just says create group, and we have that form that we just created. Okay, we're actually still not done with all the views for groups. There's 2 more, a little more complicated views that we're going to do in the next lecture. And that's basically the views for joining a group and leaving a group. So that's going to kind of require a little bit more of code to actually make those work. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to post to the Q&A forums. Definitely did a lot here, and we definitely typed a lot. So if you're stuck on something or something didn't seem quite right, you can always just copy and paste from the provided notes. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.